we can start recording now. So, hey, hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this book discussion organized by Global Extractivism and Alternatives Initiative. EXALT in short is an international network of scholars, activists, and policymakers dedicated to collaboration and knowledge creation around the pressing crisis stemming from extractivist policies and practices. This initiative draws together diverse critical analysis of the phenomena of global extractivisms and the myriad alternatives being actively pursued in both theory and practice. My name is Melisa Yasav. I'm one of the many contributors to EXALT, and our focus today is Markus Kröger's recent book, Iron Will, Global Extractivism and Mining Resistance in Brazil and India. So this book explores the role of extractivist policies and their global significance and the local efforts to resist them in the context of iron ore mining in Brazil and India. We'll put the open access book link on the chat soon. So please feel free to use the chat for questions and comments and relevant discussion and for interacting with each other during the presentation. You can also share questions and comments with your audio and video on after we had the presentation and discussions between the author and the discussants. So let me first introduce the author of the book and our two discussants. So as you all probably know, Markus Kröger is the author of the book Iron Will. He's an associate professor in development studies at the University of Helsinki, an Academy of Finland research fellow, and one of the founding members of the EXALT initiative. He has written extensively on global natural resource politics, conflicts and social resistance movements, and the economic outcomes, especially in relation to iron ore mining and forestry. He's also an expert on political economy, development, and globalization in Latin America, India, and the Arctic. Then we're joined by two great discussants. We're joined by Professor Alf Nilsen. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Pretoria and a scholar of social movements, political economy, and global development. He has researched and written extensively on relationship between social movements, state formation, and the political economy of development and democracy in India. He has worked on a range of conceptual issues related to the study of social movements, historical capitalism, and global development. We're also glad to have with us Sakshi Aravind, and she's a PhD student from University of Cambridge who works on indigenous environmental justice in Australia, Brazil, and Canada. Her research areas include legal and indigenous geographies, comparative environmental law, multi-species justice, and political ecology. So next I'll just give the floor to Markus, and after that Professor Nilsen is going to discuss the book's contents with Markus, and from his point of view, and then Aravind will continue from there. So I'll just give the floor to Markus next. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for organizing this session. So and for everybody for joining us. So I will talk a little bit with some slides about some of the key features of the book, and then we can maybe focus on some aspects that you find to be most interesting. So this book is based on like over 10 years of research. It took 10 years to write it, in other words. As a backdrop of it is like my comparison of global industrial forestry, and there I found out that if resistance uses specific strategies to resist pulp investments, they were able to discontinue the continuation or the expansion of those tree plantations for the pulp mills, even in difficult circumstances. And in this new research project, I wanted to see if this applies also in another sector, so in mining, and in this case, iron mining, and in different political contexts, so Brazil and India. And the key here, the key extractivist moment that I'm interested in is the so-called commodities supercycle, we see here that from 2005 onwards, especially from 2008, there has been a very dramatic rise in the average price of iron ore. So this is like, and the price is currently again at these heights. So we have seen a dramatic change in the valuation of iron ore. And because of these new high prices of iron ore, especially because of demand from China, there has been much more pressure on getting more of the iron ore out of the ground. And this has led to a very rampant mining boom, both in India and Brazil, and especially in those countries which are like key exporters or were during the study period. So I studied this period from 2005 to 2015. That's the period I'm interested in, and seeing what kind of politics this rise has created in these key exporting countries. So here are the places that I compare in the book. It's a systematic comparison across these sites, and these were the localities that I found primarily by field research, multi-sited political ethnography, to be the key locations of where iron ore is extracted. So you have a bunch of cases here in the state of Odisha, south of Jharkhand in India, then many in Chhattisgarh, and these are, especially here in the south, there's a civil war, very bloody civil war, very violent setting. And then you have cases in Karnataka, Goa, and Tamil Nadu. Some of these are just projects, they are not active mining areas. And in Brazil, you have cases in Minas Gerais, and then in the eastern Amazon, and a little bit in here in the west. But the key thing here that got my interest awoken to this topic was that in 2010, there were very important outcomes already in Goa. Like there was a moratorium on mining, and later on in 2012, 2013, most of these mines were discontinued in India. And currently about half of them remain closed. So it was a major outcome, and I wanted to see what was the role of resistance in this. And in Brazil, there were also important outcomes, which I discussed. That in comparison, it was not so dramatic as in India, but still notable. So I visited places like in 2011, went here to the world's biggest iron ore mine, owned by the biggest iron ore extracting company, Vale, in the eastern Amazon. And here visited with the local communities affected by the mine living around here in the Amazon area, like the Brazilian landless movement, indigenous people, trade union people, and so on. And when I talk about resistance, I don't mean just traditional social movements like the Brazilian landless workers movement, but like organized movement, but also NGOs, trade unions, churches, city mayors, all kind of actors. So that's kind of like the resistance category. Here you see a picture from Goa, from eastern Goa from 2013, where I visited, and here you see that the hilltops are excavated. So this is also illegal mining. So the mining took place outside of the lease areas, and it was heavily polluting, causing a lot of health problems in the area. And when you do this kind of mining, the vegetation will not really return up there, and the downhill areas will get severely polluted. Agriculture becomes more difficult. Also, tourism gets harmed. So there was a large social movement in Goa, actually several social movements that started to resist very strongly this mining continuation and so on. So I think these kind of events can be very well studied through the rhetoric or concept of extractivism, originally used in especially in Latin America. So I use this to refer to this kind of extraction that leaves barren, toxic, or void spaces and destroys the prior places and lived environments of both humans and other than humans, and causes also extreme inequality. So it's a neoliberal process, and it's also non-developmental, not really creating new business, but mostly having to do with like getting the resources and getting the richnesses out from there. And this is what it looked like in Goa when the mining was there. So there was a lot of dust and pollution. It was very unhealthy for people. But then in 2012, the Supreme Court and other courts in India ordered the mines to be discontinued. And this was a big surprise for many. But as I argue in the book, these outcomes would not have been reached without the active resistance actions. So there were specific actions which targeted the courts and so on. And there were also other kind of strategies. So these are the kind of 5 key resistance strategies that are identified. There are also others, but these are the 5 in which I focus on and which work. So First, there's an organizing and politicizing mass social movement. So by this strategy, I mean that you have like an actual social movement. And with that, I want to compare, and I compare across the cases, if it helps if you are like politicizing and having a like massive support locally, or if you have just a specialized more technical quality character NGO, which is specialist, for example, in litigating the courts or so on. And then you have campaigning by non-modernist framing, and that refers to, for example, discourses and framings in rallies where people say that this place is unique, this is our home, we love it, using poems and so on, and not participating in like wanting to get like monetary compensation or saying that this could be compensated in ecological terms or in some other monetary terms. And it also includes, you know, non-modernist actors, such as like saying that the hill is a god or so on, or waterfall in the area is a deity, and the waterfall would be destroyed, so the deity would die, and so on. So I observed the presence of those that really challenge the non-modernist, the modernist apparatus of extractivism and its logic of framing these things that are extracted such as resources and these areas as like resource frontiers. The third one, and this was the most important strategy, is protesting peacefully and physically so that it is noted. So, for example, blocking the export railroad or blocking export channels of the resources. So the iron ore, for example, you just don't let it get out of the region, or you are blocking the building of the mines and so on by putting yourself physically in the way and so on. So this was used very effectively. And then there's networking. There are different types of networking: national, global, regional, of different qualities. And so I compared whether these were present in each of the case, and then what were their impacts, if they were used separately or simultaneously. And then the fifth one is what I call co-producing the state, or embedding the state while retaining autonomy of the movement through embedding in electoral, institutional, or judicial politics. So here is one example of a protest in India and the kind of framing used there in the protest about mining. And there are like important connotations that this research has for global sustainability issues. So currently it's quite clear that, for example, the iron ore and steel complex produces very much of pollution, greenhouse gases, and it's essential to keep the minerals in the ground to solve the problems. It's not enough to just do boycotting campaigns or stuff like that, but you actually need to start to stop the expansion of further destruction through these projects. And here are some photos from the protests in Brazil, in the Eastern Amazon, where there's a long railroad to export the mineral to East Asia, primarily from the Carajás mine that I showed earlier. So the local land-based movements and the indigenous people together have several times blocked the actual railroad for several days and caused millions of dollars of harm to the company that way. So these protests need to be disruptive, innovative. That means like something new, so that the media gets there and it's not bored, pioneering, and it's important that they are also non-violent and massive to get safety for the protesters in these contexts of Brazil and India. Of course, in other contexts, this might vary. So the book presents and applies a theory of investment politics, and here is a framework that I use. So here on the right-hand side, you see different kinds of resistance agencies. So you have peaceful resistance here. Then in some cases, there was armed revolutionary resistance and agency. And then there were also armed secession type of like resource conflicts or investment politics influencing actions, especially in northeastern India. And then on the other side, you have corporate agency here, which tries to expand the extractivist projects. And then the state is here, with particular government strategies, part of the state, but not the same thing as the state. And these boxes here in the middle refer to different kind of political games where these different actors meet. So for example, in electoral politics, the companies normally try to fund several candidates that support their agenda, whereas the peaceful resistance tries to support other politicians, which then, for example, say that we will be against mining and they will pool their votes. And I studied the impact of such moves, also in the judicial field and other fields. This private politics here refers to politics which is taking place outside of the state. So these are taking place within the state, and these are taking outside of the state. So you have direct negotiations like stakeholder dialogues, corporate social responsibility schemes, and you make deals, like local people make deals with the companies so that they can expand the mines, but they can get some compensation, for example. And then you have these very violent armed conflicts where by arms people resist the expansion of those mines in their forests. And then you have paramilitaries and the state troops against the guerrillas. So this is one of the situations in India. This is from here, from southern Chhattisgarh. So here you have this Philai steel plant, a big steel plant with tens of thousands of workers, which produces India's railroad tracks. And they are running out of the minerals here in Dalirajara mine. And they want to open a new mine here in Raugat. And they need to build a new railroad and open up the mine here. But this area is home to the indigenous people of India, Adivasis here, and they are heavily resisting this by peaceful means. And besides this, there are also these Maoist Naxalite guerrillas which are in arms and resisting by arms. So there's both peaceful and armed resistance against this expansion, and it's very violent context. And they really want and kind of need to open up this to continue producing cheap steel here in this mill. So it's not like that you would be able to buy from the markets wherever, like steel is and iron ore is very bulky mineral. So that's a specificity of this politics of iron ore. You need to get it quite near or have some cheap logistical maneuvers. So this is also from the book. There's also a theory of trying to explain more in depth why and how these kind of changes take place. So for example, how does the push of extractivism happen? So you have changes both at the same time at the physical space, physical level, when you destroy the prior lived environments and put up a mine there. And then this is linked to changes in the social space. Then you create new social hierarchies, class distinctions, you bring new people in, dispossess the other people there who were living there, enclose their lands. You have more economic, social capital, cultural capital changes here. So I used some of the concepts of Pierre Bourdieu here, and then link to what happens in symbolic space, and also how resistance can use what I call symbolic acts of merit to challenge these changes, like challenging the legitimacy of the mining actions as development, for example. And this is the last slide. So here are some key lessons. Protest and avoid private negotiation and deals with corporations. So the resistance was able to really shut down or discontinue these destructive operations, even in very difficult circumstances of these rising prices. For example, in Goa, in a matter of few years, the state of Goa lost like about a little bit less than 5 billion euros due to the illegalities in royalties that were not paid. So it was like really a loot. And then I found out that if you use these 5 strategies, then it was more likely that you managed to discontinue the operations. And in India, it is applied in all cases. So if you use them, you were successful, or those movements were successful. Of course, they didn't know this beforehand, so you cannot know beforehand what will happen. So it's safer to use all the strategies. But that said, I also found that in some cases, you only had to use 2 or 3 of the strategies, and then you still had success if you had an easier context, maybe. But in Brazil, it was more difficult, and this suggests that it's a more difficult political context for resistance than in India, maybe having to do with the traditional role of Latin America as like a resource frontier of the world and so on, and different histories than India. It's like comparing the middle of the book in these kind of contextual chapters. And then there's a warning about the engaging in private politics, stakeholder dialogues in the book. But maybe I will stop here to hear more from you, and if you have any specific questions, so we can go to them. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, next we give the floor to Professor Nilsen. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. And thanks to Markus for writing this book. I want to start by congratulating him. This is an excellent and very timely book. I think it provides us with a granular analysis of some of the most decisive and significant struggles of our time, basically, because what's at stake here is, well, it's civilizational, basically. And I also think that it's crucial that this is a book that focuses on the majority world, on the global south, where many of the struggles with the highest stakes in our time are currently unfolding. These are struggles in which the stakes couldn't be higher, and therefore the question of what can be learned from struggles such as those that Markus has investigated in this book is also imperative for our collective human future. So this is not a book that's a waste of our time, and I want to congratulate you for producing that. This is a book that contributes to discussions that needs to be had. I have a few questions for you, many of which will try to sort of push beyond the book itself, to use the book as a sort of launch pad for precisely some discussions that are quite pressing in the current moment. And I wanted to start not by speaking specifically about resistance, but about the conceptualization of the context of that resistance. And that context is, of course, extractive capitalism, which you particularly discuss towards the start of your book. Now, it might be that this question reflects more a sort of a puzzle that I've been struggling with myself over the last few years, but it goes somewhat like this, that, you know, we currently have a large and growing body of studies and analyses and conceptualizations of capitalist nature-society relations. It's been an exponential growth there since the 1990s, just following sort of, let's say, the past 25 years or so of scholarship, or even 20 years from when we had something like John Foster's Marxist Ecology come out and start a new conversation. And this body of theory really does help us to understand why we're confronting a planetary emergency. But a question that I'm struggling with, and that you might be able to comment on, given that your own study is situated in part, sort of partly in discussion with that literature, is whether it's movement relevant, right? What I mean by that is, do these analyses of how capitalism constructs its relationship to nature in a way that disturbs, if you will, the metabolic relation that should be there in nature-society relationships, and exhausts our resource bases, pollutes natural sinks, and so on and so forth. Does that help us in thinking about how to fight against that planetary crisis, and how to win the kind of struggles that need to be launched? When I was reading your book, I was sort of thinking about how we can make that more evident, because otherwise, all of that theorizing, which, although it's insightful, might actually equate to a kind of fiddling while Rome burns, and that's not not advisable. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, simply simply from the point of view of someone who has been studying the way in which extractive capitalism impacts on local environments, how it impacts on or pushes up against the limits of world ecology, so that we could perhaps start having that conversation in a more explicit way. So that's the first of my questions. The second of my questions takes me towards the strategies that you outline and discuss, the 5 strategies that you've just talked us through, that movements can combine in order to bust extractivist booms. Now, there's a 2-part question here. One is whether you could elaborate for all of those Brazil and India, which to me is interesting as someone who studied struggles against dispossession in the Indian context. It's surprising from the point of view that one would assume that the regimes that movements have, or the regime rather, that movements have been up against in the Brazilian context would be more likely, if you will, to enter into a dialogue with social movements from below and to grant concessions to social movements from below, compared to the regime that Indian social movements spent a lot of the 2000s and the 2010s fighting against. Which was a regime, and I'll have more to say about it in a little bit, which was a regime that at the same time as it granted concessions to social movements, also really put the pedal to the metal when it came to mining and extraction, and spent energy liberalizing the country's mining sector in order to capitalize on the increased demand for iron ore from India. Of course, this was also a regime that labeled the Maoists and the Naxalite movement as the biggest internal security threat to India, and that launched a major counterinsurgency offensive against that particular movement. So I'm curious as to what might explain that difference. Moving beyond the Brazil-India comparison, I also wanted to ask if you have any reflections about, you have these 5 strategies that you've distilled from your study of Brazil and India, which are, of course, hugely important nodes, if you will, in that constellation, which is often referred to as the rising south. So middle-income countries in the global south that have been part of what some people read as a challenge to Western hegemony in the world system and all of that. Now, when you look at the movement struggles that are happening there, I'm wondering if they are ahead of the curve. And I say that because it's been my experience that many of the battles that are and struggles that are going on in the global south yield lessons and important lessons for similar struggles in the global north. So what I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit further about is precisely the generalizability across the north-south axis of the world system of the struggles that you've looked at. Because as we know, there are important struggles against extractive capitalism going on in the global north as well. We see this in North America. We see this in, well, I'm far away from home now, but sort of in the really northern parts of the Nordic countries and so on and so forth. So what are the lessons that can be distilled and, if you will, transposed across the north-south axis, or rather the south-north axis of the world system here? When I came to the conclusion of your book, I was intrigued by your brief engagement with authoritarianism there, and I think we need to talk more about that too, because it goes to the kind of regime types that social movements are up against. So again, then going back to the sort of the Brazil-India comparison, most of the movements you studied and unfolded in the context of left of center, or sometimes, you know, one could call the UPA regime in India more centrist than left of center, but nevertheless, 2 regimes that for different reasons had a stake in opening up dialogues with social movements and in sort of positing themselves as progressive governing forces. So I'm talking about then the UPA in India and the PT regime in Brazil. That is now gone. Whether or not those were genuinely oppositional regimes can be discussed. I mean, my argument about India is very clear that it wasn't. There was an attempt by the Congress Party to try and reconstruct some of the hegemonic position that it had lost over a very long period, and it failed very badly to do so. But whatever our opinion about that is, it's changed. That context is gone, and it's gone due to the rise of authoritarian populism. Right, so we've seen the tremendous rise of Narendra Modi. We've seen the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil. They're not the same. They represent a similar kind of politics. So for extractive struggles, or for populist struggles against extractive capitalism. And one last question that I'd like to put to you, and I know I'm putting a lot on your plate, but that's the kind of thing that your book invites. You present a really detailed analysis of how social movements can stop things from happening, by slowing down investments or abrogating investments entirely by busting extractive booms and by changing the governance of extraction. But how about more fundamentally changing things by bringing about alternative edifices for nature-society relations that can operate within world ecological limits? I ask this question, or I raise it, because towards the end of your book, you write about the metapolitics of carving out ontological openings beyond our current nature-society relations. So will you talk a little bit more to us about this, about, you know, what your thinking is about a politics that doesn't merely stop things from happening, but that changes the way things are done in a more radical way? And I'm going to stop there.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. So should I reply now or?
Yes,
yeah. Okay. So I can offer quick comments. Those were wonderful notes. Thank you so much for taking all the time for that, Alvin. Yeah. So starting from the first, so yeah, these studies on ecological Marxism and so on. So in this book, I mostly of this strand of studies, I mostly build on the world ecology strand by Jason Moore and others. So I think it's a good backdrop to kind of understand the broader things that are changing. But then I think most of those studies, they really focus more on like outlaying the problems and situation where we are at now. But there's very little focus in comparison, in comparative terms, in actual like politics, in actual, for example, resistance struggles. And if there is focus on, for example, environmental justice movements or so on, it's typically quite broad and it may even flatten things. So here I wanted to have a very specific focus on one sector, mining, and in a subsector, iron ore, and then to understand how those specific struggles are taking place. And I didn't know the setting before I went to the field. And it was really a surprise for me to see that there are so many local resistance struggles, national movements, networks, and so on, which are already there and are having a very major impact. So there's a lot of positive actions going on around the world, which the main news and media doesn't note and which we don't know about. I think that's a very positive news and very hopeful and needs to be told. Also because if there's too much focus on this, like looking at the negative issues, then there's a danger of kind of pessimism or even doomism. And I think it's not very emancipatory or constructive in the longer term. It's better to focus on things that are more, that are helpful also for the resistance to see that things can change, or the social actors. For the second issue, so I kind of also, by these findings in this book, I challenge a little bit of the kind of understanding of capitalism as a very big thing, like that as an agent in itself, and look at it more in detail in specific instances and how it can be impacted and so on, and is being impacted and is not allowed to expand everywhere. So the comparison of India and Brazil. So yeah, I think this 2005-2015 period was quite marked by the rise of these so-called BRICS countries, and of course these struggles are related to that, especially and their rise as like global powers and whatever. And there also we see a lot of broader scale analysis that don't go into the micro level, but see this, for example, the building of national industries in Brazil or India as like a hopeful thing and good for global governance and multipolar world order, and don't really look at what that means in the local level for the communities that are then losing their livelihoods and lived environments and so on, even from the left. And then these governments were very much in favor of extractivism, even though they were called like progressive, like in Brazil, the Workers' Party government. They helped in creating these huge extractivist corporations like Vale in Brazil, giving a lot of support. But in that, I argue that they made a mistake, because then they were feeding the kind of like feeding these ever larger corporations by the state subsidies, which are now very difficult to control. And actually that was a key reason for the demise of these progressive regimes, because now you have these authoritarian regimes, which they were more likely to support in the forthcoming elections than these progressive ones, which were supporting them. And also these struggles that I discussed, they are also one of the explanations of these regime shifts. from democracy to authoritarianism, because you know, the corporations saw that there's like limits, their frontiers of expansion are limited. They cannot expand so much into the Amazon, for example, due to the new socio-environmental strength of those local movements, and also some state supporters. So what I want to say here is that states or governments are not monoliths. There are always some ministers and some instances which are more in favor of the movements, and they are not like top-down or stuff like that, but it's like an embedded relation where you have some like civil society actors within the state, and they're actually co-producing the state. And these periods and these struggles show how like democracy can be consolidated and created in these places. And for example, in Western India, it was in Goa, Karnataka, those struggles against iron ore were key moments of consolidating democratic transitions in those places and deepening democracy. For example, in terms of courts, like having democracy in terms of like who can access courts and so on. Of course, now there's the big polity difference between Brazil and India in terms of the Supreme Courts. In India, the Supreme Court has a specific green tribunal, and you can access it directly from the ground. You don't have to go through all the instances like in Brazil. And in Brazil, in comparison, it's not really so helpful, the Supreme Court, as it has been for the resistance in India. So it's not only about strategies, but also what kind of the polities were before that. I didn't get all of the questions, so if there's something left unanswered from the second point, please note me. Then of the third issue about if these are like kind of ahead of the curve, and yes, definitely I see that, because already when I was doing this research, I saw that there's a mining boom in Finland ongoing, and I actually stopped this field research for a while and went to Lapland in Finland and saw how the Finnish mining boom and Arctic mining boom is playing out there. And very similar things, quite shocking irregularities, even less royalties than in Brazil and India in the Finnish context. So yeah, it's a global world, global extractivism. It's not only a problem of the so-called global south, but it's really expanding. And I think because of that, also the five key strategies can be more generalized. For example, the thing of like avoiding these stakeholder dialogues. Then of course, in places like Finland, I think there are more professional environmental NGOs, for example, which quite routinely and with hired staff do the litigation in courts and so on. Not like in India, that in some cases you have no access to such places. You have like very poor, ethnically marginalized people who lack support, and then they have to use other means. But I think there needs to be more detailed studies in different contexts. What I want to say here in this book is also that you shouldn't make these overall claims that you should actually go to places, because I was so surprised to find out how these dynamics work in these different contexts. So I would avoid making too broad generalizations across polities. Yeah, I think authoritarian regimes need to be studied differently, and for example, Nordic welfare states and North American cases and so on, and then see how much we can generalize. Then the last one about fundamental changes. Yes, I think in themselves, these struggles are very important. Like the activists that I talked to, they emphasize that the very acts of starting to protest, mobilize, go to protest, in these cases, when these mines threaten the homes of the people, local people, in many cases, for most people, they are like first instances where they start to resist or join the movements which were already there. Like these were mostly not kind of like ad hoc movements, but they were actually like built on existing mobilizing structures, if you will, or mobilizing actors. But then new people joined, and then they gained strength, and their habitus changed in terms of burdia, and like agency increased, and also the ways they understood the places. So yes, I would say that there are these ontological openings happening when these extractivist expansions happens and there is resistance. And when you resist the expansion of the mines, which would destroy the places, you are still winning. And for example, you see this in the case of Belo Horizonte city in Brazil, where the local middle classes really changed their attitude towards the nearby Candarela Hills, and they were like building on something that has been called like Buen Vivir in the Andean context, but a Brazilian version of that. So yeah, I think those things are also happening at the deeper level, like I explore at the symbolic level, symbolic space, but also at the physical and social spaces. So there's like a homology between those changes and in the resistance actions as well.
Thank you, Markus and Professor Nilsen. Maybe we can now move to Sakshi. We don't have any questions at the chat in the moment, so go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much for those two great talks and the exchange. I mean, most of it has been already well articulated by Professor Nilsen, and part of has been answered by Markus as well. What I'm going to talk to now is going to sound more like a muddled collection of comments and questions, but let's just wade through. So I'm very glad to be here today to be part of such an important conversation elicited by this key work, documenting and analyzing the multiple ways of offering resistance to extractivism, which in turn deepens democracy and exposes the will of the people in how they would like to engage with the state, and the modes of resource extraction, if any, has invaluable lessons, academic or otherwise. It's important to use these rich findings in our work towards re-theorization and rethinking of epistemologies in relation to social movements that challenge and engage with extractivism. In many ways, the 5 textured strategies that the book relies on brings out the significance of the evidentiary materials used in the research, making a compelling case for understanding the success, whole or partial, of the democratic movements which the work studies. I must remark at the inordinate amount of hopefulness that the book invests, extracts, and radiates. It's one of the kind that I'm not accustomed to while thinking about the countries I study, or simply would not have associated with India or Brazil either. And in that respect, it certainly has been a very illuminating research in the book. The book sets out some clear parameters and materials it has worked with, and this clarity of thought, content, and style is important to set apart what I'm going to speak while drawing from my research. Markus makes an interesting observation at the outset that the nature of struggles, conflicts, and political economies would differ substantially from the nature of the mineral extracted. In my doctrinal work on the nature of the juridical spaces and its encounters with social movements and many forms of extractivisms, there's a pressing need to straddle these different kinds of differences, of course. At this point, I do have some questions about the process of understanding extractivism and its attendant violence, or complicity with the state itself that determines how social relations are shaped and dictated. I hope we'll be able to converse about it in due course. This understanding of extractivism and people's resistance vastly differ in post-colonies, at least as far as the term can be used, where countries have gone through the national liberation movement. Does this understanding differ from how we think about extractivism's rootedness and states' brazen endorsement of it in settler colonies? Does one find oneself wondering if environmental movements and social relations they organize are recalibrated differently if they do not have to address the land question? I'm thinking more in the sense of land back and sovereignty, but of course there could be many other forms of land questions. I keep coming back to the hopefulness and the success stories of the book. One of my jurisdictions, Australia, had 2 promising outcomes last week. The first, less related to extractive violence, but more about settler colonial erasures and destruction through developmental projects, was the story of Jaburang budding trees. The road expansion project in central Victoria had not only threatened, but had also managed to destroy nearly 400-year-old trees that were of indigenous, which were sacred to indigenous heritage. The sacred trees and sites continued to be destroyed after that, which induced the First Nation to take it upon themselves, crowdsource, and buy the piece of private land on which the sacred tree stood. The irony of buying back stolen land is not lost on anyone. And yet, what is more striking is the shifting of the responsibility on indigenous communities to safeguard their heritage, protect their knowledge forms, cosmologies within the familiar trope of economic transaction. Not very different was the news of the New South Wales government shelling out $100 million to buy back the Shenhua coal mine just in time for the by-elections, a coal mine which had gathered much resistance from farmers and traditional owners. There was even a challenge by the traditional owners against the environmental minister's failure to declare the region as a heritage area before the federal court. Much to everyone's disappointment, the court fell into the trap of balancing economic interest with Aboriginal heritage. The present government action puts an end to the coal mine, not to some of the significant issues raised by it. And I think much of it can be asked about individual movements to stop coal or iron mines, as the case may be. Does it extinguish extraction as an activity or extractivism as a defining and organizing logic of social and economic life? Does the cessation of an activity due to social movements or due to government action as a result of a range of compulsions leave behind the recognition of the collective action, epistemologies that resist and decolonize, recognition of labor that has gone into rooting out violence and building something constructive and lasting? There's something that lingers even when Markus writes about campaigning through non-modernist framing. I can imagine why it is, and it must be used in tandem with other strategies in India. But elsewhere, in cases that have made it into courts in Brazil, or every case in Australia, indigenous cosmologies, epistemologies, and ontologies are not simply a matter of non-modernist framing. They are constitutive of indigeneity. It's a way of life, a way of challenging the settler colony, which constantly seeks to erase and eliminate the alternate ways of world-making practices. So trying to challenge an extractive project because it is harming indigenous cultural practices and knowledge forms functions as more than a strategy. It is the only way of asserting sovereignty, encountering the past and present violence of displacement. In a settler colony, allies are hard to come by, where rights over land are much at issue as the rights over natural resources, or simply the larger effects of a mine to communities, both indigenous and non-indigenous. So I'm sure this is something we can answer together, but if the social movements are not drawing in state apparatus and juridical spaces to entrench their resistance to capitalism and extractivism, in my field, settler capitalism more specifically, will they be obligated to carry out acts of resistance over and over again whenever the next project comes along? The governments may respond or retaliate in each case, which is why the rise of next authoritarian regime, which your postscript and conclusion express concerns over, might uproot any long-standing community action. For instance, once the New South Wales government got an inclination that the specialist environmental courts were about to overturn every coal mining permit on the grounds of climate change, there was some hurried work to pass the legislation that limit the grounds considered by the environmental planning commissions while negotiating permits for coal mines. Thankfully, that's not taken off yet. What interests me most in the book are the state embedding actions, where judicial politics takes prominence. Most of my work delves on what a juridical space can do to the sense of justice and the direction of the social movement. While I inhabit the world of law and we don't have many worlds or words to traverse in doctrinal work, unlike your extensive field work. But a lot of my work invests questionable hopefulness in courts, seeing them as vital or even decisive factors in entrenching the knowledge forms that guide the social movements outside of the juridical, so that the next act of resistance has it easier for itself. When I say how can we think of something that's more lasting in a social movement that asserts itself as addressing not merely extractive violence, but also epistemic and ontological ones, there are two instances from Brazil that comes to mind. Pronounced and more illuminating evidence of outcomes facilitating indigenous environmental justice is manifest in the recent settlement of Ashaninka people of state of Acre. Given very few indigenous environmental cases have seen a conclusion, let alone successful conclusion, it's of little surprise that out-of-court settlements are prominent. However, the settlement accord in this instance gives precedence to indigenous voice that rests on the key element that the defendants issued an apology for their actions. The Ashaninka community living along the Brazilian Amazon had sued the defendants, a logging corporation, represented by its directors, for carrying out illegal logging between 1981 and 87. The Ashaninka people were recognized to be the rightful owners of their territory in 1992. However, the logging invasion in the 1980s left a lasting impact on the tree diversity and cultural identity of indigenous people. Thousands of mahogany, cedar, and other native trees were chopped down between these years to supply wood for European furniture industries. The logging happened without the consent of indigenous people, and many form of compensation for their, or was there any form of compensation for their loss? Unlike other unsuccessful cases against logging in Brazil, Ashaninka people sued the logging corporation owned by the family members of the then governor of Acre. While the case had partial success in courts, gaining interlocutory injunction in federal courts and even in STG, the Supreme Court, the final decision was still pending for an unusually long time. However, in April, the prosecutor signed a large settlement amount on behalf of the indigenous people. Admittedly, compensation amount was exceptional and unprecedented, but more importantly, the settlement was conclusive only after the offenders offered an unconditional apology for the destruction of the reservations and indigenous territories in the past. The best part of the settlement was in the insistence of an apology, and the apology included defendants expressing their regret for all the evils, to quote from the settlement accord, for all the evils caused respectively, recognizing the enormous importance of the Ashaninka people as guardians of the forest, zealous in preserving the environment and in conserving and spreading their customs and culture. The Ashaninka community considered the prosecutor's office as an ally, making this case an excellent illustration of what coordinated indigenous environmental litigation can guarantee. In the post-settlement statement published by the Federal Ministry, the Attorney General of the Republic, who is also the prosecutor in the case, observed that the Constitution holds the sacred rights of indigenous people, and they have the right to choose their lives, material destinies, and make political choices. One of the leaders of the Ashaninka community emphasizes on how the litigation was a commentary on the relationship between indigenous communities and environmental resources. He suggests that the present victory was a victory for indigenous communities across the world who suffer the loss of land and ways of life. In a way, both the money and the apology contribute towards remedying an incommensurable loss which has so far been not recognized at all. The second and the most recent discovery during my research, and I will stop after this, was the judicial training modules in Brazil. A closer examination of Brazilian judicial culture suggests that in the recent past, at least since 2016, there has been an epistemological turn in the law. The juridical spaces, especially evidentiary practices, are opened up with a specific objective of achieving indigenous environmental justice. This turn has been more than a sheer academic exercise. It has been targeted to involve and engage judges at all levels so that indigenous litigation do not suffer from discriminatory outcome. So the Brazilian National Judicial School for Formation and Development, NFAM, has designed new indigenous training programs for judges of all ranks, including magistrates, across the states. The project begins with the acknowledgement that in spite of the recognition of the ancestral rights to land, culture, and sustainability under Article 231 of the Constitution, indigenous rights have come under severe strain because of the extractive activities. These affect not only specific rights to land, but also cultural existence and indigenous knowledge. Interestingly, what is dubbed as a modest and ordinary training program creates a sharp and straightforward transition into justice-oriented jurisprudence. The training materials emphasize the importance of indigenous knowledge in environmental protection, forest management, and sustainability goals, even when carrying on their traditional economic livelihood activities. The crucial part of the training manual is where it requires the judges to understand specific training as an avenue for exchange and diffusion of knowledge in order to promote intercultural dialogue between indigenous people and magistrate and other actors of the justice system. This creation of two equal worlds between the juridical and the indigenous has been without precedent in the law, especially in the dominant non-indigenous scholarship. The manual continues to cover not only the ontological, but also epistemological, observing, given the importance of the, to quote from the manual, given the importance of the topic and the distinct character of indigenous law and claims, which requires knowledge from other disciplines, in addition to a purely legal approach, it is considered important to participate in the lives of other actors in the justice system. This process aims to encourage the magistrate to have dialogues with other knowledge forms, recognizing them and their subjects, their legitimacy with a positive impact on the realization of indigenous collective rights recognized by the Constitution. Training the judges to listen to the knowledge and ways of life of indigenous people carefully will enable sensible construction of their judgments. It would also offer judges training in theoretical and empirical references that help to ground their decisions. While there is a temptation to dismiss this as a symbolic exercise, the recent victory of Ashaninka tribe and the remarkable settlement indicates immediate effects of these epistemological turn in juridical practices. Since I must end now, from the diverse encounters with extractivism in and out of settler colonies or post-colonies as you study, I only wonder how and how far should we assess the social movements? What is the apparatus and analytical tools for thinking about environmental and anti-extractivist movements, whether they have used the 5 strategies, have gone beyond? I think there's a significant amount of thinking and theorization required about social movements that not only generate outcome, but generate frameworks and epistemologies that provide foundations for new social, economic, and more importantly, legal orders. Thank you.
Wonderful, excellent comments. Thank you so much, Sakshi. Sounds very fascinating, your findings as well. So maybe I'm glad you brought up this issue of Australia and settler colonialism, or these contexts that have been traditionally considered to be settler colonialist in more general sense. Of course, in most of the cases that I also studied, there was some sort of internal settler colonialism. For example, people who were not locals coming in and taking over the indigenous peoples or other locals' lands, and there was a caste and class violence dimension in here. But looking at the broader picture, it's interesting because Brazil and India were supposed to become like the major exporters of iron ore during this period of 2005, 2015. They had such prognosis and policies, but then partly because of this resistance that I study in this book, it happens so that Australia is currently by far the biggest exporter, and mostly to China. So China had to look for the resources from somewhere else, and Australia became that exporter in the iron ore sector. And so it's I would say that in this, based on this, I would say that the setting for resistance is more difficult in these settler colonialist settings maybe than in Brazil and India, for example. Also, there's, for example, the Indian government was persuaded by the resistance that it has a national interest in curbing the export of iron ore, especially to China. So there was like an international relations dimension here, because steel and iron ore are like strategic resources if there's a war, for example. So that then, because the government, or more likely the courts, but also some government policies started to demand, for example, that if you build a iron ore mine, you can only build that if you have a steel mill. So this was the official rule. So then it was blamed as a resource nationalist government. And then if you look at, for example, South Africa, you have the Marikana massacre of the mining workers there, and very clear racial dimensions there, violence. So I think maybe there are issues here to consider comparing to these settler colonialist countries. Of course, in Brazil, you see, especially in the Amazon, also the settler colonialist dimension very clearly. In, for example, southern soybean farmers coming with European origin coming to the north, and also mining sector. Then about this non-modernizing campaigning, definitely it's not only about framing or a strategy, but for many people those are actual ontologies, and they are like their worldviews and the ways they understand the world, and they are not used strategically. But it was interesting to see in Brazil that those what are called like non-modernist framings are mostly still hidden in this struggle. They are not used, and this is exactly because of the kind of overall colonialist violence still ongoing there by the settler colonialism. For example, Brazil, there's this very strong idea of progress and technical issues. So they are like these issues are translated into the modern language. So for example, in the case of Conceição de Mato Dentro, in the Minas Gerais state, there are like the most of the people who are harmed by the Anglo-American mining project there. Minas Rio project, they are like Afro-Brazilian Quilombo communities. And they mostly have like religiosities like Umbanda, which are not really following the Christianity in the same way. And there's a lot of prejudice against them. And they, for example, see that the local waterfalls are also goddesses, like Oshun lives there and so on. But it was interesting that these framings were not used. They didn't like say that openly, but they hid them because of this prejudice and thought that that wouldn't be effective. And there would be this prejudice by the white middle classes in the city of Conceição de Mato Dentro against them, which there was already. But I don't know, maybe I think based on the lessons in here, I think it would be important to start to use also those other, or more openly, those other ontologies, other kind of framings, ontologics, and not translate everything to the terms of modernity. And then, yeah, I think you are definitely right about the important victories of the indigenous groups in Brazil recently in some instances, and those would be very much needed, that kind of exercises of changing the languages and so on. Like now, just a few weeks ago, the Brazilian indigenous groups managed to get like primary importance from the Supreme Court in the vaccination order in the COVID situation, which was a victory for them. Yeah, if you have, if I missed some key point, you could maybe.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that was well answered. Yes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sakshi and Professor Nilsen, for your contributions. I think we next get to go to some questions. There was first a question in the chat by John McNish. So he's asking if he's at first saying that your work, Markus, adds significantly to thinking about resistance strategies to extractivism, and he wonders, however, if Markus is overstating resistance as opposition to the state or the extractive projects. Are there not also more signs of is that with law and regulation, dialogue and institutional formation of people in resistance, identifying with the state and energy development? I also wonder if your work indicates that extractivism is more than political action, a logic, an ontology, a statement of the requirements of modernity, etc. Would you like to, Markus, answer that?
Yeah, thank you, John, for the question. So, more than political action, I will come to that later. But yeah, I think that there was, of course, also support to mining in Brazil, also by some local communities, but there was this class cleavage there normally. Like in many cases, like in this Conceição de Mato Dentro, the local middle classes in the city, they supported mining, and they've actually leased their mines to or sold their mines to the mining company. But then the rural poor, which have less abilities to claim land to which they would have constitutional rights, they were suffering more and they were resisting. And this was the case also in India, like in the northern part of Odisha state, in the Jodha area, there was not really important resistance there. It was mostly co-opted by the upper caste people, according to the analysis there. So there are dangers in having these kind of movements, many activists said, where you have like this big hierarchy in terms of social ethnic capital there. And then most people had already vanished, and they were like poor mining workers in the area. And when the mines were then shut down, they actually wanted or created like protests to demand for the reopening of the mines. Because an important outcome here was that in India, there was created this kind of specific commission, MB Shah commission, which then started to observe the irregularities of mining around the country, starting from the first places of Goa and Bellary in Karnataka, and then it went to eastern India. And then some of the mines there were closed kind of like by the state governments before the investigations could come there and reveal the problems. So that happened, for example, with Joda. So the outcome of blocking or discontinuing the mining there was not really because of the local resistance, but as kind of like an impact of the resistance elsewhere in the country. So these kind of things are compared to this incorporated comparison. But in overall, I would say that there was the resistance was more significant in these politics in many cases than the support. Of course, in Brazil also there were mines which were not resisted, like all the mines. I'm looking at the expansion. I'm not looking at the ongoing operations of existing mines which are not expanding extractivism in here. Yeah, I hope that answers to the question. Yeah, extractivism is definitely an ontology and logic, yeah, of the modernity. Yeah, it's definitely more than politics. Yeah.
Thank you. Then there was a hand up. Tejendra, did you have something to ask? I can try to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Markus, thanks for a very illustrative talk. I would like to ask a question about how do you see a post-colonial laws and their implication in current extractive regime, where you know the linkage between the colonial laws and the post-colonial laws are there also in terms of, you know, that which actually create a stigma and a kind of hegemony over the marginalized section of India, like Adivasis.
Yeah, I think there are still important vestiges of colonialism there. But then again, you have like all these like Forest Rights Act, and I think Alf knows this much better than I do in India. This support that Adivasis have had recently. So maybe he's better to talk about this than me actually. But yeah, if you are looking at the more specifically at the colonial times, so actually what was an interesting thing here, that there was a lot of concessions given for mining during the Second World War in India. And when then you had this new mining boom in 2005, 2015, these really dormant leases that were given then during the colonial times were like retaken by the mostly upper caste people who lived somewhere else and started to be made money of, for example, in Goa. So it's quite interesting that you can have these colonial like land grants sleeping there and then waiting, and then you have this global extractivist push, and they are like then started to be used. So you have all these like kind of hidden problems that become acute then when you have these fluctuations in global resource prices. So it's quite important still, I think, these changes or these like land tenure situations that you have there in the underground because of colonialism.
Thank you. We still have time for a couple of questions, around 5 minutes or so. There was one question in the chat from Boengu. You mentioned some example of using public interest litigation in India in the book. How do you perceive the impact / effectiveness of such judicial strategy in supporting other resistance strategies?
Thank you. This is an excellent question. So what the people mentioned is that this is actually a potentially perilous path. So normally you should only use the litigation in the very end. It can result in very quick results, but if you lose, then the budding political movement, local movement easily loses its legitimacy. When you kind of say that, no, what's happening here in terms of mine is completely right. So the specialists who had been using these courts in India, for example, they say that it's always better to first try to build the mobilization and build a strong local movement. This is like very visible, for example, in the case of Bellary in Karnataka, where there was like this mining mafia by the local governors and state ministers of the Reddy brothers. And there was a local NGO, SPS, very much involved in these actions there, and some kind of local movement, but not so strong. and a lot of the area got very quickly turned from agricultural lands into mining. And after the Supreme Court and others ordered the mines to be shut down, discontinued, then you have had protests by locals to reopen the mines because they have no other options for livelihoods. And they have re-elected people who support mining there. So it would be important to kind of stop these mines before they are opened, because when they are open, it's quite hard to have then a constituency that would support the resistance to mining if there are no other alternatives in that locality. And then again about the judicial politics. So it's important if you use it. It's important, for example, in Goa, the local specialists, they were more aware of the mining laws of India than actually the local judges. So they could really help the judges and strengthen their actions and capabilities by building up dossiers, mapping the illegalities by satellites and so on. So the mining companies, for example, put blue canvas on top of the mining areas so that you couldn't find them from the satellites. So there was this kind of struggle ongoing in the satellite space as well in here. But then they handed on these dossiers to the judges and helped in that sense the courts build them up, their capacities. So I think that those are important notes. And of course, in Eastern India, in many cases for the Adivasis, it was beyond their abilities or connections to be able to use this judicial politics.
Thank you. Was there any other questions for Markus? You can just raise your hand physically, or then use the reaction emoji on the bar below the screen. There was Arpita.
Hi, Markus. I haven't yet read your book, but of course I'm familiar with what you've been doing, and it's really excellent. It's great to have this. I have not really a question, but sort of a reflection, maybe also Alf's comments on the authoritarian regimes, and we've seen, of course, much smaller scales and larger number of mines in India in these iron ore belts versus these sort of really gigantic multinational structures. And in Brazil, with this move towards authoritarianism, do you see the Indian sort of, say, national extractive capital moving towards these larger, more consolidated giant systems in India, which would maybe then be more difficult to resist? Sort of that is the first kind of an idea, because you're seeing more and more power to these corporates, a few of them, Adani's, getting larger. So I wonder whether from what we have now, you know, large numbers, smaller. In Goa, for instance, there are, say, 100 players, but smaller, less powerful. So one would be about, the authoritarian regime movement towards this consolidation. And second, if we can conceptualize in India, say, the end of Modi and the end of authoritarian regimes soon, say in the near future, how then do we move, what differences would you perceive in how these extractivities will play out in the near future, if we have the fall of authoritarianism, maybe both countries? That's all.
Thank you. Great question, Arpita. And so I think, of course, it makes a difference when you have Vale, the world's biggest iron ore mining company in Brazil, and heavily supported by the state and even progressive actors there, like the Workers' Party. Like, it's so much harder to resist that corporation, which makes, like, in profits, it made in 2011 profits of 20-30 billion euros per year. I mean, they could have bought with 1 year's profit 6 times Nokia's smartphones, for example. It's a huge player. And then if you have in India, these all kind of like small players, like you have small national companies owned by the state, and then you have all these different national companies and some transnational like POSCO from South Korea and so on. So I think because the targets were more spread, and they even had their different struggles that helped the resistance in India, definitely. Like in the case of POSCO in Odisha, that steel mill complex, like the local national companies like Tata, they wanted to also get that project or get the iron ore mines in Kandahar region. So there was this intercapitalist struggle. They actually had like litigations between each other, these companies there. So it was very messy. It was not so consolidated. And I think this period of so-called progressive governments, especially in Brazil, it helped to even further consolidate and merge these companies, and Vale wanted to become the global leader of the sector of mining, and the government was helping in this. And they got a lot of subsidies for this, and from the Brazilian Development Bank and so on, loans. And I think now, after that, when they did that, then those groups behind that, those moves, they saw that, okay, we have got enough of the state funds, now we can have an authoritarian regime and relax these legislations, get more of land, expand more, because this regime, progressive regime, is also putting on its other hand limitations for our expansion and human rights violations and whatever. And maybe next, after this authoritarian period, after its privatizations and consolidations in both India and Brazil, like getting like through privatization more power, then there will again be a move to, I don't know, maybe Lula in Brazil, and then they will get more state support. So, you know, they might play this out like that, like they get a bit from here and then a bit from here. So that might be one option what will happen.
Great. We are already out of time, but there was still one more question from Gutu Vaesa. So maybe Markus could quickly answer that question, then we can end the book discussion. So Gutu Vaesa is saying, you indicated that networking is one of the key strategies of resistance. Is this a standalone strategy, or does it involve the coordination of diverse strategies? Do you have comparisons of success taking into account the level of coordination among strategies?
Yes, thanks, Guti. That's an excellent question. So yeah, definitely, it's like I identify this. There are specific like forms of networking, and the most efficient form is like kind of replicative networking, where you actually replicate the success story of using those 5 key strategies in another context. So you, for example, you have movements that were successful elsewhere, like in Tamil Nadu, in Salem, which was like the first case of resisting the mining expansion to a hill there. And then they went to nearby city of Tiruvannamalai, where there was already a local resistance movement, but then they went there to help because they had success, and they knew how they had success, how they had been able to stop that project and helped in there. And that resistance in Salem, for example, it was first based on cases in elsewhere, like the activists moved across the country. So you have those lessons. So that's like, I think, the most important form of networking. Of course, there's also global networking, which is important at national level, and I discussed that in the end of the book in a specific chapter. And yeah, the coordination among the strategies so that you use them simultaneously is very important. These really support each other. They together create what I called in a previous book, the fostering of contentious agency, or the creation of contentious agency as a whole, which is really a main process that is really important in these and other struggles, I think.
Yes, thank you so much. So, Iron Will, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you would like to know more about EXALT, you can always email us or check our website, follow us on Facebook or Twitter. We are hosting a book launch in May 20th for a volume called Our Extractive Age, Expressions of Violence and Resistance. Some of contributors to EXALT have written chapters for that book. For example, Markus Kröger, Christopher Shagnon, and Sofia Hagalani-Alba, who are in this room at the moment, among others. We'd like to thank Sakshi, Aravind, and Professor Nilsen for joining us and sharing your valuable insights with us. We truly appreciate that you took time from your busy schedules, and thank you so much, Markus, for introducing Iron Will. So I'll just put quickly on the chat the link to our Extractive Age event page if you want to also join us there. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all your time. And
Bye-bye.